We shall commence this module by discussing about foreign trade. In the modern time, not a single country is or can be economically self-sustaining, has prospered over the past years and has benefited various nations across the globe. In simple words, foreign trade is the exchange of goods and services among different nations and is an important source of revenue for developing nations. India, even prior to independence, recognized the importance of foreign trade for achieving rapid economic growth, and therefore trade policy has been a focal point ever since. However, the structure and direction of the foreign trade have undergone a radical change because of the changes in the policies as discussed in the chapter Trade Reforms 1991 and New Trade Policy 2009 to 2014. The pre-reform period did not witness any significant changes in the foreign trade, especially the export sector, but in the post-reform period, there have been notable changes in the trend, pattern and structure of the foreign trade. The assertion that liberalization will favor the manufactured goods and diversify the export sector has been materialized. The changes in the pattern of exports have been more or less similar to the changes in the pattern of production. The increasing share of manufactured goods in exports is a reflection of the pronounced growth of the share of manufactured sectors in gross domestic product. Remarkably, share of petroleum products have increased in exports, and we may expect that India may emerge as an Asian petroleum hub in the near future. On the other hand, the recent export trend marks the relative poor performance of the textile sector. This is an indicator that India is not able to receive entire benefits from the removal of the multi-fiber arrangement. However, imports have grown faster than exports in the post-reform period, and this has led to huge current account deficit. During the period of 1990 to 2008, share of exports in India's GDP rose from 7.13% to 23.48%, while the share of imports in GDP increased from 8% to 29%. India has been an old participant in world trade. The opening of Suez Canal, speedy growth of the shipbuilding industry and the rapid construction of Indian railways has further promoted its participation. There was rise in the output of oilseeds, cotton and jute during the period 1900 to 1914, largely to a flourishing export trade. The First World War impeded the India's foreign trade. However, immediately after the war period, the demand for raw materials increased and India's export again increased. But imports too increased during this period due to increased spending of the consumers. India's foreign trade again got a setback by the Great Depression of 1930s, mainly due to the sharp fall in the prices of the commodities. But further, India achieved huge export surplus during the Second World War and accumulated the substantial amount of foreign exchange. In the post-independence era, during 1950s, India lacked the enthusiasm for foreign trade and mainly relied on the domestic factors to fuel growth. It adopted the strategy of import substituting industrialization, and therefore export played a smaller role. This meant extensive protection of domestic industries based on infant industry argument and overvalued exchange rate. This resulted in growing demand for imports and discouraged exports. India's exports suffered mainly because very few incentives were available to a limited set of the manufacturing industries and agricultural products. High level of imports coupled with high inflation and budget deficits led to foreign exchange crisis, which resulted in the devaluation of rupee for the first time in 1966. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the foreign trade scenario, follow the trends in the trade deficit of India, appreciate the diversification of the composition basket of commodities traded with India, know the changes in the list of the trading partners of India. Let us now look into the export-import growth scenario. On the macro level, exports growth was almost stagnant for the period 1950 to 1970. The growth rate was in the vicinity of 1.8% per annum. As discussed, this was due to import substitution and lack of export stimulation measures. On the other hand, imports grew at the rate of 4% per annum. This was due to the importance given to industrialization in the first few years of planning process. However, this trend discontinued after 1966 when the severe adverse effects of large imports on balance of payments were visible. At this time, Indian currency was devalued and import control regime was tightened. It is important to note that the world trade during the same period grew by 7.5%, but India failed to take advantage of the opportunities offered by the growing world trade. The emphasis of the industrialization process was on the public enterprises, but they were in the infant stage and could not make any significant mark in the world market. Other domestic industries were constrained due to licensing system and modernization was not easy to come about. Thus, India remained the exporter of primary products when the world trade was diversifying into a large number of industrial products. Interestingly, India's exports performed comparatively better in 1970 than the previous period. The average growth rate was 18.92% per annum during this period, but it fell sharply in 1980s. To make the analysis simpler, we discuss the decadal growth rates. The growth rate of exports in 1980 was mere 7.85% per annum. However, the decline in imports was marginal. Imports grew at the rate of 15.89% per annum in 1970s and 11.54% in 1980s. In absolute terms, India's exports have increased from $1,269 million in 1950-51 to $8,486 million in 1980-81. Imports during the same period have increased from $1,273 million to $15,869 million. India faced severe balance of payment crisis in 1980. As a result, comprehensive policy reforms were undertaken in 1991. In 1990s, export grew on an average of 13.33% per annum, but export growth was still subject to wide-ranging fluctuations during this period. For instance, the 2 years of 1991-92 and 1998-99 showed negative growth rates in exports. Imports, on the other hand, grew by 10.93% per annum. The growth rate varied between 2.2% to 28%. However, imports showed a negative growth rate of 19.4% during 1991-92. But the base of the imports and exports enhanced considerably during 1990s, and the commodity basket in both export and imports witnesses diversification. During 2001-2005, export grew by 13.88% per annum, with over 30% growth in the year 2004 and 5 alone. From 2005-6 to 2007 and 8, exports grew in the vicinity of 25% and the imports grew at the rate of 31% per annum. The next major setback for India's export was the global crisis in 2008. Rising the inflation due to high oil prices and the collapse of large investment banks around the world led to recession. In 2009-10, imports marked negative growth of 0.78% for the first time in the last 2 decades, were also impacted. The fall in the trade was arrested in 2010 as the growth in volumes of trade in emerging nations was more robust than that of the developed economies, just as the fall in 2009 had been less severe. India was among the few countries which weathered the global crisis well and even surpassed the pre-crisis peak of trends in trade. The recovery has been possible due to the fiscal stimulus imparted by the government and the low base of the preceding years. In 2013 and 14, the growth rate of the exports was 4.1%. This was a great turnaround from the previous year's negative growth of 1.8%. In 2014-15, exports grew at the rate of 5.3% with the highest and double-digit growth rate of 12.4% seen in May 2014. On the other hand, import growth has declined sharply from 32.3% in 2011-12 to 0.3% in 2012 and 13. In 2013-14, imports marked a negative growth rate of 8.3% and this trend continues in 2014 and 15 when imports fell by 13.2%. The trend in imports can be attributed to several measures taken by the government to curtail the value of gold and silver imports. Let us discuss India's mercantile trade. India's mercantile trade has increased manifold from $195.1 billion in 2004 and 5 to $764.6 billion in 2013-14. As per the World Trade Organization, India's ranking in terms of leading exports improved from 30 in 2004 to 19 in 2013 and in imports it increased from 23 in 2004 to 12 in 2013. Though the export share is still less, it has definitely increased since the economic reforms of 1991. India's share in world export was 0.56% in 1991, which has increased to 1.52% in 2009. Even when India's export growth has almost continuously been above world export growth in the 2000s, but still countries like China, South Korea or Taiwan have made greater global impact when compared to India. Taking account of data, we do find that India's mercantile trade as a proportion of GDP increased from 29% in 2004 to 41.8% in 2014. But after growing by 4.7% in 2013-14, India's mercantile exports moderated to 2.4% in 2014 and 15. On the other hand, the value of petroleum, oil and lubricants imports, which accounted for 36.6% of India's total imports in 2013-14, declined by 7.9% in 2014-15. But this was largely due to the decline in the price of the international crude petroleum products. However, a cause of worry is that there has been a contraction in exports and imports since December 2014. Even though this has led to a temporary improvement in the trade balance, but the reason for the decline in the exports are to be considered. According to Surajit Mazumdar, the fall in international oil prices and its impact on the value of trade explains this decline only partially. In fact, it is the industrial stagnation which has reinforced this tendency of falling exports, which is a negative sign for the economy. Let us now discuss the trade deficit. Trade deficit has increased many-fold over the past years. During 1980s, in the first half of the decade, it works out to be $5,985 million per annum, and in the later half it was $5,669 million per annum. The year 1990-91 witnessed a trade deficit of $5,932 million as imports registered a growth rate of 13.5% as opposed to 9.2% growth rate of exports. However, in 1991-92, the trade deficit declined substantially and reached to $1,546 million and imports also declined by 19.4%. This was due to the strict restrictions imposed on imports, but these restrictions had an adverse impact on the industrial growth. As a result, massive import liberalization measures were undertaken in 1992-93. Consequently, trade deficit again touched a peak of $3,345 million in 1992-93. During the 8th planning period, trade deficit averaged at $3,456 million per annum. This was considerably less than the trade deficit recorded in the 6th and the 7th plan period. But the situation again deteriorated in 1997 to 2002. The trade deficit was as high as $8,412 million. Except the year of 1999-2000, imports remained sluggish throughout the period of 1997 to 2002, but this was due to the slowdown in the industrial sector, which resulted in dampening of the demand for the imports. There was marked revival of the foreign trade in the period of 2003 to 2007. Exports grew with the rate of above 20% per annum. The rate of growth for exports touched 30.8% in 2004 and 5. This satisfactory performance was due to improved global growth and recovery in the world trade. On the other hand, competitiveness of the Indian industries has been enhanced due to the corporate restructuring and opening up of the economy. There has been consistent pursuance on the manufacturing and corporate sector to be more export oriented. This was resulted in firming up their activities and providing a supporting base to them. Thus, both the external and domestic factors were responsible for this adequate performance. On the other hand, imports also increased substantially during this period. The main reasons were high international crude prices, lower import tariffs, and booming domestic economy. As a result, the trade deficit increased considerably in 2006 and 7 and it was $59.32 billion. The rise in the oil import bill alone was 39.4% in a single year of 2006 and 7 to 2007 and 8. After this, the year 2008 and 9 was of the global recession, but still the exports managed to increase, but again rise in import was greater than the rise in exports, so the trade deficit continues to increase. In 2012 and 13, trade deficit was $190.3 billion, which declined to $135.8 billion, mainly on account of a decline in the growth rate of imports. However, growth in the export in this period remained sluggish as 4.7%. The decline in imports owed largely to the negative growth in the gold and silver imports. In 2014 and 15, trade deficit increased marginally by 1.6%. Low growth rate of both export and import resulted in a slight increase in the trade deficit. Next, we shall discuss the composition of foreign trade. The development of an economy is often seen in terms of the structural development of the nation, and the changes in the composition of the items exported and imported clearly reflect the rate and speed of the structural changes operating in an economy. In the pre-independence era, main exports of India were primary goods like jute, mica and cotton, while manufactured products constituted the bulk of the imports. However, with the process of industrialization, the composition of foreign trade had undergone significant changes. At the time of independence, things like machinery, oil, vehicles, chemicals and metals constituted more than 70% of the total imports. Considerable changes were seen in this area with the introduction of Mahalanobis's model in the second 5-year plan. During this period, the emphasis was laid on the capital goods and the basic industries. So, capital equipment were imported in large quantities. In 1960, cereals held a significant share of 16.1% in total imports, which declined to 0.8% in 2008 and further to 0% in 2012. Similarly, the raw materials that once had a significant percentage in the total imports have declined to the negligible rate by 2012. For the current analysis of changes in composition of imports, we study the 2 years of 2003 and 2012 and classify the import baskets at POL, petroleum, oil and lubricants, and non-POL items. Import of POL items has grown at the rate of 28.5% in this period, while the non-POL items on the other hand have grown by 24.8% over the same period. The increasing requirement of petroleum products for a growing economy like India does not come as a surprise, but the limited availability of domestic petroleum resources and restrictions on exploration licenses have resulted in the increased share of POL imports in overall imports from 28.7% in 2003 to 34.5% in 2013. In exports, a visible trend is that of decline in the importance of agriculture products with a remarkable rise in the share of manufactured goods. The share of agriculture in total exports has declined from 44.2% in 1960 to 13.5% in 2013, while that of manufactured products have increased from 45.3% to 61.1% over the same period. This reflects the transition of the Indian economy from being backward to a more dynamic industrial economy. For instance, since 2004 and 5, engineering goods have occupied the highest place in India's export earnings. Now, looking at the commodity basket of exports in the year 2003 and 2013, we find that agriculture and allied products have witnessed a high growth of 22.2% in this particular time frame. This includes basmati rice, marine products, meat products, oil meals, spices, wheat and sugar. On the other hand, manufactured goods have registered the growth rate of 18.4% in the same period. The manufactured goods include engineering goods, chemicals and related products, textiles and ready-made garments. The interesting point to be noted here is that the combined share of the manufactured and petroleum and crude products in total export is 81.2% in the period of 2003 to 2013. With the share of manufacturing products declining from 76.3% in 2003 to 61.2% in 2013, we may conclude that the decline has been taken up by the petroleum and crude products. This is because their share has actually increased considerably from 4.9% in 2003 to 20.1% in 2013. Moving on to discuss the direction of foreign trade. Since India was ruled by the British, so during the pre-independence period, the direction of foreign trade was determined by the colonial relation between India and Britain. A major part of India's trade was with Britain or its colonies, and this continued for some years after independence as well. As a result, in 1950-51, the combined share of United Kingdom and United States in India's export earning was 42%. On the other hand, India did not have significant trade relations with other countries like France, Germany, Italy, etc. However, India has developed political and diplomatic contacts. As a result, new avenues for trade has changed. At present, after 6 decades of planning, the trading relations have exhibited marked changes. It is to be noted that the importance of the OECD countries in the total imports of India has declined over the period 1960-61 to 2012-13, while the share of oil exporting countries, that is OPEC, has considerably increased over the same period of time, that is 4.6% in 1960-61 to 38.6% in 2012 and 13. This is mainly because of the dependence of India for oil requirement on these countries. In the year 1950-51, the share of UK was 20.8% and that of USA was 18.3% in the total imports. But this has changed afterwards as India has procured most of its imports from USA. As a result, the share of UK has declined to 1.3% in 2012 and 13. Currently, major part of India's import is sourced from Asia, 27% of imports in 2003, which increased to 57.7% in 2013. The rate of growth of imports from Asian countries is recorded at 26% for the period 2003 to 2013. It is to be noted that from being sourced through a number of countries in 2003, imports are now being concentrated in the Asian countries only. Since 2007, Asia being the largest import source of India. Europe with a share of 18.7% comes after Asia, followed by USA for 11.9%. For exports, the OECD countries again stand at the peak. Their share was 66.1% in 1960-61 and 34.2% in 2012 and 13. On the other hand, the OPEC group had a share of 4.1% of total exports in 1960-61, which rose to 20.8% in 2012 and 13. At the time of independence, the share of UK was as high as 23.3%, which has declined substantially to 2.8% in 2011 and 12. US enjoyed the share of 19.3% in 1950-51. So basically, India was dependent on US and UK for major portion of its export earnings. Currently, India's largest export partner is Asia. Exports to Asia have grown by more than 23% from 2003 to 2013. The next largest export destination is Europe, followed by America. Thus, one can notice the shift towards trade within the Asian zone rising. As of 2013, share of Asia in India's export rose to 50.1% when compared with that of 42.2% in 2003. Though trade with other countries like Europe and America has risen over the 10-year period under consideration, but the share in overall exports has declined. The shift of export direction away from America and Europe may be attributed to the slowdown in the economic activities in these countries, which has caused the import demand from these countries to contract. Now, we will summarize what we have discussed in this module. After witnessing fluctuations, the robust foreign trade in the recent years points to a return to the path of strength that was in evidence before the global financial crisis of 2008. The correction in the international prices of crude petroleum and the opportune time for withdrawal of restrictions on gold imports has been responsible for the revival of trade in India. Exports have registered shift in commodity composition, with share of manufacturing goods has declined to give way to the export of petroleum and crude products. In concern with imports, while POL share has increased, within non-POL category, there has been an increase in import of gold, coal and ores. From a geographically dispersed country source profile, import sources are now being concentrated in the Asian region. In terms of export destination, again, Asia has emerged to be a major partner in the recent years.